There's a smell that divides farmers into two camps. One camp considers the smell a nuisance, the sharp, ammonia-edged, unmistakable stink of fresh livestock manure being spread on cropland. The other camp considers the smell money, not metaphorical money, actual money. Nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium, and 14 micronutrients being deposited on a field at zero cost per pound by an animal that was going to produce the manure, regardless of whether the farmer used it or wasted it. The smell is the smell of fertility. The smell is the smell of a fertilizer bill that doesn't exist. The smell is the reason that for 10,000 years of agriculture, every civilization on Earth returned its animal waste to its cropland because the civilization understood that the nutrients the crop removed from the soil had to be replaced. And then the cheapest replacement was standing in the barn chewing hay and producing daily a concentrated deposit of everything the soil had given the crop. Then the chemical fertilizer industry arrived, and the manure became garbage. The transition happened between 1950 and 1980. Anhydrous ammonia, 82% nitrogen, liquefied under pressure, injected directly into the soil through a knife applicator, replaced the manure spreader as the primary nitrogen source on American cropland. The ammonia was precise. The ammonia was measurable. The ammonia could be applied at exact rates. 150 pounds of nitrogen per acre, 180, 200, whatever the soil test recommended, dialed in on the nurse tank regulator and delivered to the root zone in a single pass. Manure was none of those things. The manure was variable. The nutrient content changed with the animal, the diet, the age of the manure, the moisture content, the storage method. A ton of fresh dairy manure contained approximately 10 pounds of nitrogen. A ton of composted beef manure contained 14. A ton of poultry litter contained 60. The farmer who spread manure was guessing. The farmer who injected ammonia was measuring. The measuring won. By 1990, approximately 80% of the nitrogen applied to Missouri cropland came from commercial sources. Anhydrous ammonia, urea, UAN solution, purchased from the co-op, delivered by truck, applied by custom applicators, or the farmer's own equipment. The manure spreader, the piece of equipment that had been as essential as the plow on every diversified farm for a century, was parked in the fence row, left to rust, but eventually scrapped or sold at auction for $200 to the Amish farmer who still used one. In Grundy County, Missouri, the flat, rich corn and soybean country north of Trenton, where the soil is deep and black and the yields are 200 bushels if the rain comes and the fertilizer is applied, the chemical conversion was nearly total. By 2000, fewer than 10 of the county's 280 crop operations used livestock manure as a primary fertility source. The rest bought commercial fertilizer from the co-op in Trenton or the retailer in Spickard. Anhydrous ammonia at 25 cents per pound of nitrogen, MAP at 35 cents per pound of phosphorus, potash at 22 cents per pound of potassium. A standard corn fertility program, 180 pounds of nitrogen, 50 pounds of P2O5, 60 pounds of K2O, cost approximately $72 per acre in 2000. Shin on 600 acres of corn, $43,200 per year in fertilizer, purchased from a supply chain that originated in natural gas fields in Trinidad, phosphate mines in Morocco, and potash deposits in Saskatchewan. There was one farmer in the county who didn't buy from Trinidad, Morocco, or Saskatchewan. His name was Leland Poncelet. He farmed 440 acres outside of Laredo, a crossroads community so small the highway doesn't slow down. And he ran 65 head of beef cattle on 200 acres of pasture that bordered 240 acres of corn and soybean ground. Leland's fertility program was his cattle. The 65 head produced approximately 1,300 tons of manure per year, a mixture of feces and bedding that Leland composted in a concrete-floored pad behind the barn for 60 to 90 days and then spread on his cropland with a new Idea 213 ground-driven spreader pulled behind a Farmall 756. The manure provided approximately 85% of the nitrogen, 100% of the phosphorus, and 100% of the potassium that Leland's corn required. The remaining 15% of nitrogen, approximately 27 pounds per acre, Leland supplied with a small application of urea in the spring, purchased from the co-op at a cost of approximately $4,900 per year. His total fertilizer purchase, $4,900. His neighbor's total fertilizer purchase on the same acreage, $43,200. In the difference, $38,300 per year, was the value of the manure that Leland's cattle produced for free. $38,300 per year. The co-op didn't see $38,300 in savings. The co-op saw $38,300 in lost sales. Leland Poncelet is spreading manure on his corn ground. He's hauling 1,300 tons of cow dung with a spreader from 1978 and calling it fertilizer. The rest of us inject ammonia at a precise rate and know exactly what we're putting down. Leland is guessing. Leland's fields smell like a feedlot in July. Leland's corn is growing on manure that nobody can measure because nobody knows what's in it. The "nobody knows what's in it" line was the agronomic objection, and it had merit. Manure is variable. The nutrient content depends on the animal's diet, the composting duration, the moisture level, and a dozen other factors that change seasonally. Now, Leland's response to the variability objection was simple. He tested the manure. Every spring, before spreading, Leland collected a composite sample from the compost pad, sent it to the University of Missouri Soil Testing Lab in Columbia, and received a nutrient analysis that told him exactly what was in his manure: pounds of N, P, and K per ton, moisture percentage, carbon to nitrogen ratio. The test cost $35. The result told Leland how many tons per acre to spread to meet his crop's nutrient needs. The variability that the co-op called a guess was, with a $35 lab test, a measurement. But the measurement wasn't the co-op's real objection. The co-op's real objection was the smell. The smell was the social weapon, the thing that made Leland's system visible and embarrassing in a way that injecting clear ammonia into the soil was not. Ammonia is invisible. Ammonia is odorless once it's in the ground. Ammonia doesn't attract flies. Ammonia doesn't require a spreader that throws chunks of composted manure 40 feet across a field while the neighbor's children wait for the school bus at the end of the lane. Manure is visible, audible, and aromatic, and the aromatics travel half a mile on a south wind in July. The smell was real. Leland acknowledged it. It smells for 2 days. The ammonia smells for 0 days. But the ammonia costs $38,000, and the manure costs nothing. I can tolerate 2 days of smell for $38,000. The co-op couldn't argue with the math. The co-op argued with the aesthetics. The aesthetics argument worked for 30 years because the fertilizer was cheap enough that the $38,300 gap felt manageable. A cost of doing business. At the price of not smelling like a stockyard. The aesthetics argument stopped working in 2008. Now let me tell you about what happened to fertilizer prices. Because the commodity that every farmer in Grundy County considered cheap and permanent turned out to be neither. Anhydrous ammonia is manufactured from natural gas. The Haber-Bosch process, the industrial synthesis of ammonia from nitrogen and hydrogen, consumes approximately 33,000 cubic feet of natural gas per ton of ammonia produced. When natural gas costs $3 per million BTU, ammonia costs approximately $300 per ton to manufacture. When natural gas costs $6, ammonia costs $500. When natural gas costs $10, ammonia costs $750. The price of ammonia is tethered to the price of natural gas, and the price of natural gas is tethered to the global energy market. The global energy market is tethered to wars and weather and pipelines and politics that a farmer in Grundy County has precisely zero control over. In 2000, anhydrous ammonia cost approximately $210 per ton at the co-op in Trenton, 13 cents per pound of nitrogen. By 2008, the price had climbed to $755 per ton, 46 cents per pound, a 260% increase, driven by the global energy price spike that preceded the financial crisis. A farmer applying 180 pounds of nitrogen per acre saw his ammonia cost go from $23.40 per acre to $82.80. On 600 acres, from $14,040 to $49,680. The fertilizer bill had more than tripled in 8 years. The phosphorus story was worse. DAP, diammonium phosphate, the primary phosphorus source for corn, climbed from $220 per ton in 2006 to $1,200 per ton in 2008. And the increase was driven by a combination of surging global demand. India and Brazil were expanding cropland, constrained supply. The world's phosphate reserves are concentrated in Morocco and China, both of which restricted exports, and speculative trading in fertilizer futures. A farmer's phosphorus cost went from $13.75 per acre to $75 per acre in 2 years. On 600 acres, from $8,250 to $45,000. The potash spiked too, from $175 per ton to $875 per ton between 2006 and 2008. A 400% increase driven by the same supply constraints and speculative trading that inflated the phosphorus market. The total fertilizer bill for a 600-acre corn operation in Grundy County in 2008, approximately $112,000. In 2006, the same program had cost $43,200. In the increase, $68,800 in 2 years was an expense that the corn price partially offset. Corn climbed to $7 per bushel in 2008. But that consumed the margin improvement from higher commodity prices and left many farmers with operating costs that exceeded their gross revenue. Leland Poncelet's fertilizer bill in 2008, $7,200, up from $4,900 in 2006. The urea he purchased for the supplemental nitrogen had increased in price along with all nitrogen sources. But $7,200 versus $112,000. The manure was still free. The cattle still produced 1,300 tons per year. The composting pad still turned the manure into a balanced fertility source that provided 85% of the nitrogen and 100% of the P and K that Leland's corn required. The global energy crisis that tripled ammonia prices had zero effect on the nutrient content of cow manure. And the war in the Middle East that spiked natural gas prices had zero effect on the bacteria that decomposed the manure in Leland's compost pad. The export restrictions that Morocco placed on phosphate rock had zero effect on the phosphorus in Leland's cattle feces. Phosphorus that the cattle had consumed in their hay and grain and deposited, pre-processed, in the bedding pack that Leland loaded into the new Idea 213 and spread on his fields at 4 tons per acre. $7,200 versus $112,000. The $38,300 gap that had existed in 2000 had widened to $104,800. The gap was no longer the price of not smelling like a stockyard. The gap was the price of a house. The gap was the price of 50 acres of land. The gap was the difference between a profitable operation and a bankrupt one. And the difference was manure. Now, let me tell you about the co-op counter. Because the conversation in the spring of 2008 was the quietest the co-op had been since Leland started spreading manure in 1992. The co-op manager in Trenton, a man named Dennis Felker, had been the primary critic of Leland's fertility program for 16 years. Dennis sold fertilizer. Leland didn't buy fertilizer. Dennis's commission on Leland's account was $4,900 per year instead of $43,200. The difference, $38,300, was Dennis's annual reminder that manure was costing his business a customer's full potential. In the spring of 2008, Dennis's phone was ringing. Not with orders, with complaints. Farmers who had budgeted $43,000 for fertilizer were being quoted $112,000. The farmers who had pre-booked ammonia at $450 per ton in January were being told the price was now $755, and the pre-book was void because the supplier had invoked a force majeure clause in the contract. Farmers who had always considered fertilizer as reliable as diesel, something you bought, applied, and didn't think about, were discovering that fertilizer was a globally traded commodity, with a price set by forces as distant and uncontrollable as the Saudi oil ministry and the Moroccan phosphate cartel. Dennis didn't mention Leland's manure at the counter that spring. The silence was its own commentary. The quiet recognition that the man who spread cow dung with a 1978 new idea was spending $7,200 on fertility, while Dennis's best customers were spending $112,000 for the same result. The 2008 spike eased. And fertilizer prices dropped by 40% in 2009 as the global financial crisis cratered demand. The co-op exhaled. The farmers exhaled. The conversation returned to normal. Leland's manure was still an oddity, still aesthetically offensive, still the system that nobody wanted to adopt because the labor was unpleasant and the smell was real and the fertilizer was cheap again. Then 2022 happened, and the 2008 spike looked like a warm-up. Russia invaded Ukraine. On February 24th, 2022, Russia and its ally Belarus produced approximately 40% of the world's potash exports. Russia produced approximately 10% of the world's nitrogen fertilizer. The invasion triggered sanctions, export bans, and shipping disruptions that removed a significant portion of the global fertilizer supply from the market simultaneously. And the price responded the way prices respond when supply is removed, vertically. Anhydrous ammonia in Grundy County in January 2022, $750 per ton. By April, $1,450. By June, $1,635. The highest price in the history of commercial nitrogen fertilizer. $1 per pound of nitrogen. A 180-pound nitrogen program that cost $23 per acre in 2000 now cost $180 per acre. On 600 acres, $108,000 for nitrogen alone. DAP climbed from $700 to $1,100 per ton. Potash climbed from $400 to $925. The total fertility bill for the standard corn program on 600 acres in the spring of 2022. Approximately $162,000. In 2000, the same program had cost $43,200. The cost had increased 200 to 75% in 22 years, and with the majority of the increase concentrated in two spikes, 2008 and 2022, that corresponded to global energy crises, over which the farmer in Grundy County had precisely the same amount of control he had over the weather. None. Leland Poncelet's fertilizer bill in 2022, $11,400. The urea supplement had climbed. Urea was $900 per ton, up from $300 in 2020. But Leland's urea consumption was small, approximately 12.5 tons per year for the supplemental nitrogen. The manure was still free. The cattle were still producing. The compost pad was still composting. The new Idea 213 was still spreading. $11,400 versus $162,000. The gap, $150,600 in a single year. The manure advantage in 2022 was larger than the total value of some farms in the county. The man who spread cow dung with a 1978 spreader was saving more money on fertilizer than some of his neighbors earned as net income. Now, let me tell you about Dennis Felker, because the co-op manager who had been the loudest critic of Leland's system for 30 years drove to Leland's farm on a June morning in 2022 and stood at the composting pad and smelled the manure and said something that the county would remember. Dennis was 62 years old. He'd managed the Trenton Co-op since 1998. 24 years of selling fertilizer. 24 years of watching prices climb and dip and climb higher. 24 years of telling farmers that commercial fertilizer was the professional choice and manure was the primitive alternative. The 2022 spike had broken something in Dennis, not his business, which was booming because the margins on $1,635 ammonia were excellent, but his confidence in the system he'd spent a career promoting. Leland, Dennis, I've been selling fertilizer for 24 years. I've watched the price go from $210 a ton to $1,635 a ton. I've watched my customers' fertilizer bills go from $43,000 to $162,000. I've watched them borrow against their grain checks to pay for nitrogen that used to cost less than their diesel. And I've watched you spend $11,000 on fertility while they spend $162,000. Same corn, same yields, same soil. The only difference is the source. They buy nitrogen from Trinidad. You get it from the barn. The nitrogen in the barn is the same nitrogen that was in the field. The cattle ate the hay. The hay contained the nitrogen. The cattle deposited the nitrogen in the manure. Now I return the manure to the field. The cycle is closed. No pipeline from Trinidad. No ship from Morocco. No train from Saskatchewan. The nitrogen goes from the field to the cow, to the compost, to the field. The circle is 400 yards in diameter. The co-op circle is 4,000 miles in diameter. My circle doesn't cross an ocean. Yours crosses 3. My customers can't raise cattle just to get manure. Your customers sold their cattle 20 years ago to plant more corn. They converted pasture to cropland. They eliminated the livestock that produced the fertility and replaced the livestock with a pipeline from Trinidad. The pipeline costs $162,000 per year. The livestock cost $38,000 per year in feed and management and produced $78,000 per year in calf sales and $150,000 per year in free fertility. And the livestock were a profit center that produced free fertilizer. Your customers sold the profit center and bought the expense. That's not an upgrade, that's a downgrade. Dennis stood at the composting pad. The manure was dark, crumbly, steaming slightly in the morning air. The heat of decomposition, the bacteria working, converting raw waste into a balanced fertility source that Leland's $35 lab test would quantify, and Leland's spreader would deliver at 4 tons per acre. And the soil would receive the way soil has received animal waste for as long as animals and soil have coexisted. The pad smelled. The pad always smelled. But the pad cost $0 per ton for the nutrients it produced. And the co-op's ammonia cost $1,635 per ton. And the difference between $0 and $1,635 was the distance between a farmer who controlled his fertility and a farmer who was controlled by his. I can't tell my customers to buy cattle, Dennis said. The infrastructure is gone. The pastures are plowed. The fences are pulled. The barns are torn down. You can't rebuild a livestock operation in a season. You can't rebuild it in 5 seasons. The transition from crop-only back to crop livestock takes a decade and $1 million in infrastructure and a willingness to go backward that most farmers don't have. Going backward is what they called it when I started. Spreading manure in 1992 was going backward. Keeping cattle on a crop farm was going backward. Running a new idea spreader instead of calling the custom applicator was going backward. My backward is what the future looks like when the present is expensive enough. In 1992, backward cost me 2 days of smell per year. In 2022, forward costs my neighbors $162,000. Backward is cheaper than forward. Backward has always been cheaper than forward. The co-op just didn't want to calculate it. Now let me tell you about the soil, because the manure was doing something beneath the surface that 30 years of commercial fertilizer couldn't replicate, and that the soil tests made undeniable. Leland's soil organic matter in 2022, 5.1%. The county average on commercially fertilized fields, 3.3%. The 1.8-point difference represented decades of carbon deposition from composted manure, the organic fraction of the manure that commercial fertilizer doesn't contain. Anhydrous ammonia is nitrogen, just nitrogen, no carbon. No organic matter, no biological food. The ammonia feeds the crop but doesn't feed the soil. The manure feeds both. The organic matter difference translated to measurable agronomic advantages. Leland's water holding capacity was approximately 36,000 gallons per acre, higher than the county average. The organic matter acting as a sponge, holding rainfall in the root zone for crop use instead of draining through the profile or running off the surface. In the drought of 2012, Leland's corn yielded 148 bushels per acre. The county average, 112. The 36 bushel advantage, $252 per acre at $7 corn, $60,480 on 240 acres, was a dividend of 20 years of manure application that the co-op's fertilizer program couldn't provide, because the co-op's fertilizer didn't build organic matter. The biological activity was the second advantage. Manure feeds soil biology. The bacteria, fungi, protozoa, and earthworms that cycle nutrients, build soil structure, and suppress disease. Leland's earthworm count, approximately 28 per cubic foot of topsoil. The county average, 8. The earthworms were the visible indicator of a biological community that was processing the manure's organic matter into plant-available nutrients at rates that reduced Leland's dependency on supplemental nitrogen. The biology was converting organic nitrogen from the manure into mineral nitrogen that the corn could use, a process called mineralization that happens at a rate proportional to the biological activity in the soil. More biology, more mineralization, less purchased nitrogen. The cycle was self-reinforcing. The manure fed the biology fed the crop fed the cattle produced the manure. The self-reinforcing cycle was the thing the co-op couldn't replicate with commercial fertilizer. Commercial fertilizer feeds the crop, period. It doesn't feed the soil. It doesn't build biology. It doesn't increase organic matter. It doesn't improve water holding capacity. It doesn't create the conditions for its own replacement. Commercial fertilizer is an input that must be purchased every year because it doesn't build anything that persists. Manure is an investment. Each ton applied builds the soil's capacity to produce nutrients independently, reducing the need for external inputs over time. After 30 years of manure application, Leland's soil was producing approximately 60 pounds of nitrogen per acre per year through mineralization of accumulated organic matter. Nitrogen that appeared in the soil profile without being purchased, without being applied, without crossing an ocean. 60 pounds per acre of free nitrogen.
At 2022, prices of $1 per pound, that was $60 per acre per year in nitrogen that the soil produced for itself, because Leland had been feeding the soil for 30 years. On 240 acres, $14,400 per year in free nitrogen from biological activity that the manure had built. The co-op's customers got 0 pounds of free nitrogen from their soil because the co-op's fertilizer hadn't built the biology that produces free nitrogen.
When the co-op's customers bought 180 pounds per acre every year, because 180 pounds was what the crop needed and the soil provided none of it. Leland bought 27 pounds per acre because the soil provided the rest. Let me tell you about how this ends. Leland Ponsela is 67 years old. His son, Marcus, manages the operation. 440 acres, 65 head of cattle, the composting pad, the new Idea 213 spreader, and the closed-loop fertility system that has been reducing the farm's dependency on commercial fertilizer for 30 years. Marcus tests the manure every spring. The same $35 lab test, the same composite sample, the same analysis that tells him exactly how many tons per acre to spread. The test has never produced a surprise because manure from cattle fed the same diet on the same farm produces the same nutrient profile year after year, by decade after decade. The new Idea 213 is 46 years old. It's been rebuilt twice. New beaters in 2004, new floor chain in 2016. The spreader cost $4,200 new in 1978. Its replacement, a modern vertical beater spreader, costs $38,000. Leland never replaced it because the 213 spreads manure at 4 tons per acre across a 40-foot pattern, and the manure doesn't care what year the spreader was built. The spreader is the delivery system. The manure is the product. The product hasn't changed since the first cow deposited the first pile on the first field 10,000 years ago. The Farmall 756 that pulls the spreader is in the machine shed.
Now, Marcus uses it for manure work because the 756 has the hydraulics and the PTO speed that the 213 requires, and because the tractor and the spreader have been working together for 46 years, and changing either one would require adjusting the other. The system works. The system has been working since 1992. The system will work as long as cattle eat hay and produce manure, and soil needs nutrients, and the farmer is willing to spread what the cattle produce instead of buying what the pipeline delivers. Fertilizer prices have eased from the 2022 peak. Ammonia is approximately $700 per ton. In 2024, down from $1,635, but still 3 times the 2000 price. The structural trend is upward. Natural gas prices, phosphate supply constraints,
Leah and potash market concentration ensure that commercial fertilizer will cost more in the future than it cost in the past. Each price increase widens the gap between the farmer who buys fertility and the farmer who grows it. Each spike validates the system that the co-op called primitive. Each correction provides the temporary relief that allows the co-op to resume the criticism. And each cycle, spike, correction, spike higher, moves the long-term average cost of commercial fertilizer further from the $0 per ton that manure has cost since before money existed. The manure was never primitive, Leland says, when someone asks about his fertility program. The manure was always the original technology. The chemical fertilizer is the new technology. The new technology works when the pipeline works. The old technology works when the cattle work. The cattle always work. The pipeline doesn't always work. The cattle don't care about sanctions. The cattle don't care about natural gas prices. The cattle care about hay and water and a dry place to sleep. I control the hay. I control the water. I control the barn. I control my fertility. My neighbors control nothing. They called Trinidad and asked permission to fertilize their corn. The fertilizer tripled in 2008 and again in 2022. The manure didn't. That's the whole story. Subscribe to The Average Farmer for more. We'll see you in the next one.